Hold on to your butt.
Da-da-da. Oh, hello. Welcome to episode 100 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As always, I'm joined by Mary, a woman who has put up with me for 100 episodes and hasn't dumped me in the ocean like tea yet. I am merely Darren. How are we doing, Mary?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a great day. We're going to have some fun today. It's episode 100. We got to find a way to celebrate.
Centennial. Well, I think we found a pretty good way to celebrate this one.
Yeah, I think so. You know, today is a special episode, not only because we have officially hit that century mark, but we do have a special guest today. But first, we certainly like to thank everybody who's listened to this silly podcast for 100 episodes. Never in a million years thought we'd even get a fraction of this. We couldn't do it without the listeners, which we definitely appreciate. That being said, you know, we don't usually do guests, but for the man joining us today, we're certainly happy to make the exception. Joining us today is Alexander Rose. He's the author of 6 books covering a wide variety of historical events. What we're going to talk about is the Lion and the Fox, the 2 rival spies and the secret plot to build a Confederate Navy. But he's also written Washington Spies, the story of America's first spy ring. And people may have seen the TV show Turn on AMC. That's his baby. He wrote and produced that. He's also awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship Award in 2020, Mary. So that's pretty big doing. So being Civil War nerds, his latest book, The Lion and the Fox, is right in our wheelhouse. So we are thrilled to have Alex with us to discuss it in all that Navy espionage that took place in England during the Civil War. So thank you for joining us, Alex. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
You are our centennial episode. We're very honored to have you on here. And like we were talking about before we started recording, the Navy has always been something that we've talked about, you know, doing a full episode on for a while. Touched on it here and there with like Fort Fisher, Wilmington and all that, but not like this. So this is going to be, you're using your book as kind of the background. Your book is going to be kind of our introduction to starting to talk more about the Navy in the Civil War.
And not to jump ahead, but Alex will be joining us on the book club here soon to talk about the specific book. You know, I think one of the most understudied and certainly probably the most underappreciated aspects of the American Civil War, you know, is the Navy. And sure, people know about the brown water ships that attacked Vicksburg, etc. But few really understand that cat and mouse game that took place between the Union and Confederates when it came to that Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan blockade to keep Southern cotton away from England and keep weapons and supplies away from the Confederacy. And Alex, your book is really the first I think I've ever really read that really delves into that cloak and dagger effort that goes so far to enlighten those who really had no idea that was going on. So maybe we'll start with the situation going in early 1861 that was facing both the Union and the Confederates when it came to the Navy.
There was a huge problem when they began, when the war opened for the Union and the Confederacy. I mean, they both relied on their, sea lanes, with the world's hyperpower, which was Britain, especially for cotton, various other textile industries. The Union under Lincoln obviously wanted to stop that trade, and so they imposed a blockade on the southern coast, the eastern seaboard and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And the Confederacy obviously needed to break that blockade. So they were playing for big, big stakes here. And one of them is that according to international law at the time, you couldn't just, as Lincoln did, say there was a blockade. You actually had to back it up with something. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, everybody would just be blockading each other. So what the Confederacy has to do, according to international law, is show that it's, they said, ineffective, that there's huge holes in it. If it's a hold, blockade, it's just simply not legally enforceable. It doesn't have to be recognized by the other great powers of the world, such as France and Britain.
That was the Declaration of Paris, 1854. And just like you pointed, if you say you're going to block it, then you better have the votes to block it. And when the Union effort started, they had about 40 ships. The Confederates really only had the 1. And it did grow in time. But if you didn't have the ability to really defend it, then it became optional. And then it became up to the country, in this case, England, to actually honor it or not. And, in England, like you said, relied so much on Southern cotton is a huge part of that economy. White gold is what they called it. And they also had to try to find the fine line, which was a big issue that happened right around when the war started, of England maintaining neutrality. And that really changed it. So when we talk about the characters involved here, Thomas Dudley had originally gotten that position. And we'll talk about him in just a minute. It must have seemed like the easiest job in the world. You sit in England, but then when neutrality happened, his job took a lot. It really turned into a real, that cloak and dagger thing. And, you have 42 commissioned northern ships. It just showed that disparity, the North and the South, when it came to industry. The South only had 2 naval yards, had one in Norfolk, Virginia, and one in Pensacola, Florida. And neither were really equipped to build a navy. And that's what this whole thing turned into. It turned into finding a way to build them and deliver them. So the Confederates really had 3-pronged attack to how to deal with this. And your book talks specifically about it. And that's kind of sets the skeleton of what the Confederates were trying to do with those 3 plans.
It was essentially, a 3-phase plan. I mean, that's quite general. That's how the book is structured, because otherwise it gets all very complicated. Yeah. And things overlap and all this kind of stuff. The South needs to keep its trade routes open with Britain, with cotton especially, and also coming back across the Atlantic, munitions, guns, and other, war material. So what they do is, and as you point out, they don't really have the industrial capacity to build their own blue water navy. They have to buy one kind of off the shelf or commission one in Britain. The way they do this is, the first thing to do is phase 1, which is to build kind of a swarm of blockade runners. The point of that would be is that would show that Lincoln's insolent paper blockade, as I think Jefferson Davis once put it, was ridiculous. It was an absurdity. Nobody should pay any attention. Nobody should honor this. So you just have a fleet of very fast, sleek blockade runners running in and out of the southern ports to Nassau and then to Britain. The second phase is that you need to build commerce raiders, that is, attack ships like the Alabama and the Florida and so on. And they would start attacking Union merchant vessels. Like, really, why should we be taking all the hits? Let's start bringing this war home to President Lincoln, really hitting his, sort of greedy northern merchants in the pocket, and then they'll kind of force him to seek an armistice with us. And then the third phase was going to be the knockout blow, and that was to build what were called the Laird rams. They're called Laird because that was the name of the shipyard in Britain. Laird's was the sort of the premier shipyard, iron built. They were masters of iron in Britain. They commissioned a couple of rams, and which were exactly what they sound like. They are big, advanced weapons platforms that were ironclad, which is, again, fairly, kind of a new phenomenon at the time. Plus, they had a giant ram at the front prow, which would basically, their job was to go out and seek and basically ram Union frigates, Union warships, and sort of drown them at sea. That would break the U.S. Navy finally. So it was a 3-phase plan that was going to go on. It was pretty well thought out, and they sent over an agent, James Bullock, set this in motion and to carry it through. And, his antagonist, as you mentioned before, was Thomas Dudley, his Union antagonist.
Yeah, the cast of characters in this is so they're intriguing, and they all have their quirks and all that. And the other thing too is Liverpool at this time is such the first thing I thought of when I read the description of Liverpool was like, this sounds like the only way I can think of it was like Gangs of New York, how New York was with that movie, how New York was at a certain time. Like, that's Liverpool is just this place where, I mean, it's obviously an area of commerce. It's where people are coming in from all over the world, but just, it's a very kind of shady spot to be.
Well, that's what I was trying to get through, that Liverpool itself is a character in the book. It's a bit like New York City was in Washington Spies. It's kind of a character's own right. It's kind of an interesting place. I mean, we're accustomed to thinking of Liverpool as where those cheeky mop tops were from, the Beatles.
Yes, exactly.
Liverpool football and things like that. I mean, that's what you basically think of when you think of Liverpool. Liverpool at the time was the world's greatest, most magnificent port metropolis. They were built more ships in Liverpool each year than the rest of the world combined by a colossal margin. It was also the center of the world's cotton trade, which was then one of the world's biggest industries. People tend to forget that now. They had a cotton exchange there where they kind of almost invented the futures and commodity markets and so on. It was a very it was a real financial center, real manufacturing center, and a real shipbuilding center. So, but again, there were, like most cities, it was a little like in Blade Runner. You have you have areas where unbelievable poverty.
Yes,
mostly caused by the rise of mass industrialization and the movement of rural populations populations and from Ireland into the cities for jobs and for, working in factories and being on the waterfront and being sailors and so on. So you have colossal overcrowding there. But there's also extreme wealth too. You have some of the sort of the fanciest addresses in the country there. People who have made, well, families, dynasties that have made titanic fortunes at first, in the 18th century, it was mostly slavery. That converted into cotton trading, as I mentioned, shipbuilding. But the interesting thing is, in about 1800 or so, Liverpool was this fairly modest little sort of seafront town. It had a lot of fishermen there. That was about it. But over that 60 years until the Civil War, I mean, the population sextupled, I think. I mean, it was a huge influx, and it was the second city of Britain, which basically meant it was this, it was like, kind of like sort of New York on the Mersey. So Liverpool is a very interesting city. I like the fact that the book is set there because people don't really think about Liverpool that much.
No.
Yeah.
Off the beaten track, even though it's a major player in the world.
Yeah, and you can see why it was the kind of the perfect backdrop for espionage. Bullock is able to kind of hide out there and stay 2 steps ahead.
Interesting guy. We'll talk real quick about him. James Dudwady Bullock. He's from Savannah, Georgia, and he's going to be that liaison that's going to be between the Secretary of Navy Stephen Mallory for the Confederacy and England. Despite Georgian by birth, he's going to live in New York City, and he's going to have a job working for the Alabama Steam Company, and he steamed a boat called the Bienville from New York to New Orleans and all these other places. But once the war started, he wasn't allowed to take his ship south of Washington. And then he started to be forced to start transporting Union troops. And at that point, he wasn't interested. He resigned. Bullock was without a doubt a Southern sympathizer who hated Republicans. Fun fact about him, he was the uncle of Teddy Roosevelt, which is interesting, who helped him publish his book later in life. We'll probably get to that towards the very end. But soon later, he's recruited by the Attorney General, Judah Benjamin, to basically meet with the rebel Secretary of Navy, Stephen Mallory, we talked about this mission. And Bullock was a great captain. He and his ship certainly would have been an attractive target for someone like Mallory. And this is all happening right at the time of the firing of Fort Sumter in April of 1861. Bullock was a captain. He made a deal with the Confederacy to, for the most part, be their secret agent to help them as that middleman from the rebel government and those Southern sympathizers in England and Liverpool, which there were a lot, who lived and died by needing cotton. And he was basically, they were going to use this to help basically finance these boats to help that 3-pronged attack that Alex talked about a little bit ago. And in Liverpool, to his point, was the capital of sea building at the time, as well as a lot of colorful characters. And like to Mary's point, it sounds like a Charles Dickens town. Ultra poor people, a lot of rich people. And really, this is kind of where the whole thing would begin. And really, and there was neutrality was hitting right at this time as well. In a perfect world, he would go over there, to Alex's point, he'd pick a few boats out, he'd send them over, and that was it. But when neutrality happened, it really changed everything. And once Bullock started his activities, the Union had to be really obsessed with stopping him, because they realized pretty quickly what he was up to. And the guy that they put in charge of kind of being the one who foiled him was a guy named Thomas Dudley. And now, Alex, I'm sure you'll agree, Dudley was everything Bullock was. I mean, this is a guy that every time he smiled, his face cracked. He just was never really had much of a personality. He was an old Quaker. He was somebody who, unfortunately, was in a sea accident in the 1850s that almost cost him his life. And because of that, when he had a choice to pick what job he wanted, being the Minister of Japan, which sounds pretty cool, or a consul in Liverpool, he's going to pick Liverpool because they had better medicals in his mind. He had a better set of medicine. Just like before neutrality, his job was probably pretty easy. But once it happened, it turned into him being one of the most important people in the Union government in American history that no one knows about.
Dudley and Bullock are the lion and the fox of the title. As you say, they were very, very different characters with very, very different backgrounds. And they both, they kind of mutually loathed each other. Bullock was the fox. He was, he was, again, quite sleek, quite devious, very cunning, very amusing, very charming, very dexterous, quite worldly and cynical and all this kind of stuff. Whereas Dudley was a kind of a, middle-aged Quaker with no discernible sense of humor whatsoever. But he was the lion. I mean, he was a rigid abolitionist, following the tenet of his creed. From decades before the war, he would put on disguises or what he thought was a kind of a southern slave trader outfit, which consisted of a big hat and a whip, and head down south and, try and, either purchase slaves who'd been sort of kidnapped from the north and brought down to the plantations of the deep south, or he would, otherwise rescue them and bring them back across the Mason-Dixon line, which was a dangerous game to play. I mean, it was very easy to end up on the side of the ditch if you got caught doing this. He backed up his words with action. So he is the lion. He has a sort of a valor to him, a steadfastness to him that Bullock didn't really have. And so you've got this clash between these two very conflicting, very different characters in one small place in Liverpool. Their offices were just several minutes walk from each other. It was a very small world, and as you say, Dickensian world of Liverpool. So that was what really attracted me to the story, the fact that they're both very, very different men, and they both use different strategies to win. And out of both of them, Dudley, the lion, has to change the most. He has to, over the course of the book, he has to become the fox. And when he does, he eventually, sort of takes out Bullock and his work. So it's a great story of, a man who sort of learns the ways of the world and overcomes the challenges.
Bullock, he's in Liverpool. It's basically every bar is like the cantina in Star Wars. If you can imagine that. That's kind of how it is. One issue that they have to work out pretty quickly is finance. They have to find somebody with deep pockets who can help finance all this. They had one in a contact from a company based in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was called Fraser, Trenholm and Company. And its senior partner was a guy named Charles Prelo. And Prelo, he was from Charleston as well, and he actually fought for the United States in the Mexican War. But now he was a Southerner through and through. He actually flew a Confederate flag on his mansion in England. And Bullock was on his way to England. He's going to take that circuitous route, and it's going to take him all the way there. For the most part, the Union knew he was coming. They knew he had about $400,000, or probably pounds, to buy this fleet, really to buy 10 steamboats at the time. And for the most part, he is now an official rebel agent. Dudley is the one who's going to chase him down. You picture Bullock as the guy twisting his mustache. He's the one in the alleys. And I always imagine, Dudley to be kind of like one of those, the guy from like a Prohibition type thing, trying to chase Al Capone around. This straight dour by the book government guy. Yeah, he's like an Elliot Ness type of character. Yep. Speaking of Dudley, he was new to the job. I mean, the U.S. minister to England, he was a guy named Charles Adams, who, he was the son of John Quincy Adams and the grandson of John Adams, presidents, who all had that same job at one point, which I always thought was kind of neat. He was new to the job, and then when England took neutrality, which I have to think ticked off both the North and the South for the most part, it created this two bickering brothers, the North and the South, fighting over England. So Adams' task, for the most part, more than anything, was to make sure that England didn't enter the war on behalf of the Confederacy. And everything really hinged on that naval blockade. It was one that was the big challenge. And so you can see exactly how the whole thing is going. Because when we think of the block from the Civil War perspective, we think of sneaking gunpowder and cannon and everything through the blockade into the United States. But the big part really was getting cotton out. And that was a huge part about it, was how much their economy, for the most part, really was involved in cotton, and how much that must have made Lincoln nervous as far as that neutrality goes.
At the beginning, the South sort of scored what it looked like a brilliant goal, but in fact turned out to be a terrible own goal in declaring a cotton embargo, in the sense that they would stop voluntarily their own exports of cotton to Britain. And the reason for this was not to punish the Union, because it didn't do anything to the Union. It was to induce the British into siding with them, and in a kind of a grand, romantic Anglo-Confederate alliance of some kind against the hated North. Because, the North was not favored in Britain by any means. Lincoln was regarded as a tariff man and more concerned about his merchants, a bit of a thug and all this kind of stuff, not pro-British at all. Whereas the Southerners were all these, high-minded plantation gentlemen, aristos. There's a kind of a sort of a strange romantic view of the whole thing. As the South knew, Britain was terribly dependent on those cotton imports. Millions and millions of bales of cotton, top grade, first-class Southern cotton coming into Liverpool each year. The reason is that Britain, they say about 20% of the population of Britain was directly or indirectly reliant on that cotton trade, which is quite mind-boggling if you think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, the people, factory owners, to the people working in factories, to the shipping trade, to bakers who made the bread for the factory workers. I mean, it could be anyone and their children and so on. The British were well aware of a very dangerous addiction to southern cotton, but it was part of the foundations of their wealth. So the cotton comes in a kind of a raw state from the south, goes to Liverpool. It's then traded out in the market, and it's then bought up by the great factory owners and manufacturers. It's then refined into beautiful textiles, shirts, sheets, anything you can think of. It's then re-exported to the rest of the world. That's where you get the giant markups. What the South calculated on was, in order to persuade the Brits to leave off this ridiculous neutrality talk and, finally, come on, guys, make up your mind, we're the good guys here, is to try and threaten a national heart attack. That is, you stop the cotton. What happens in Britain, which had just kind of emerged from, quite a lot of industrial unrest over the last couple of decades, be threatened almost perhaps with a revolution of some kind if the cotton stops. There's a lot to be said for that. I mean, it's sort of logically that works, but it's never really a good idea to threaten a superpower like that, especially when, their necks are on the line. So it doesn't work. There's enough leakage through the blockade to bring kind of enough cotton in, just enough to cover British needs. The British also begin to realize, well, why are we reliant on these Southerners? Why don't we have an empire? Why don't we grow more cotton in, say, Egypt or India? Now, the quality is nowhere near as good, and it takes some time to build up that kind of ability to process cotton as the South did. But it will happen. So the South is actually, this is a giant own goal over the course of time. But what the British do instead is they keep on just this balancing act of neutrality. They tend to have a bit of a thumb on the scale for the South because there are so many Southern sympathizers in Parliament and in business and in the newspapers and amongst the great and the good. But it doesn't work. They don't ever declare in favor of the South because they realize that they can't afford to annoy the Union too much, especially once it starts beginning to look like the Union could actually win this thing.
Yeah.
You don't want to be caught on the wrong side. So it's a very complicated strategic and diplomatic and international matter. It's not just about two guys in Liverpool having a little fight over a navy. This whole, the navy is the sort of the nub of a much larger sort of picture here, which is what I try and discuss in the book a bit about what the really big stakes are here.
80% of the cotton England got was from the American South, and that was the important part of that first phase. If they could get that blockade running successfully, it would basically give incentive or confidence those British merchants to be more comfortable dealing with the South. And that's really why Bullock was enemy number one for the Union. He was on William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, on his radar. No question about that. Bullock is going to arrive, in June of 1861 in Liverpool, and he'll meet with that Charles Priolo from Fraser Trenholm and Company. And he was dealing himself at 20,000 bales of cotton a day. So he was a big player in that cotton trade. So now what happens? Bullock has that finance ear that he needs. Someone who's going to help the cotton and keep the cash going. And because really, if you can do that, it's easy money, because he needed that money to continue building those boats. A stoppage in cotton supplied by the South would create a financial disaster. And we saw it as the war went on, especially towards the end when the blockade kind of tightened up a little bit. It was not just cotton going into the United States too. It was chandeliers and tea and all these fancy things, furs, that were going over there too well, because people in the South, they like to live a certain way, especially with the money. So they were relying on more than that. If he could get more ships and free up more ships to go through that blockade, it's going to make that economy so much better. And so when Dudley was quick to try to stop this, he's going to kind of begin to bring in some spies to find what's going on. And he had one of my favorite people, a guy that his nickname was the Black Crow, a guy named Henry Sanford. And he was a dude. He always dressed in black. He was arrogant, and I can't imagine he was happy. He had a job of keeping what he called a blacklist, of keeping an idea of what boats were the blockade runners. He didn't really go by his own set of rules. He was not averse to kidnapping, murder, whatever it took. That's how he was. But again, he's a dangerous guy because he's someone you have to keep neutrality. You can't be grabbing people. We'll talk about the Trent affair here in a little while, but you have to find a way to do it. And as you see Dudley's transformation throughout this period, you can kind of see how he kind of deals with that. A guy named Paddington Palaki is another one. These cast of characters that people don't realize unless they read your book or they study the history about what the efforts the Union was going into. Palaki spoke 7 languages. He was somebody who his job was to find Bullock. And how long did it take him to find him?
There's a lot going on before Dudley even arrives in England. Dudley arrives, I think, in December 1861. So the war's been going on a little bit. Before then, Bullock has been just ruling the roost and just beating everyone hands down because he's in a friendly environment. Yes, he has to work within British rules. He's confronted by the unexpected declaration of neutrality. When he gets over there, he has to work within certain ways. What the Union does, the early part of the war, they have Charles Francis Adams running the ministry, or essentially the embassy in London. And a fellow called, as you said, Henry Sanford shows up, the Black Crow, which I'm pretty sure is a nickname that he liked to popularize himself.
That is a great nickname.
I'm going to call myself the Black Crow. That's a cool name.
Because he dressed all in black. He was a very wealthy guy. He was a stout Republican. He believed in what he was doing. The problem with Sanford is that he was just one of these people who just loves intrigue and skullduggery and covert operations. He just loves that kind of stuff. He was a real dirty tricks man. He just loved that stuff. He goes over and he kind of takes over Union intelligence in Britain. He hooks up with a kind of a private detective there called, his name was Ignatius Palaki, but better known as Paddington Palaki, who was one of the world's first private detectives. Possible influence on Arthur Conan Doyle's, Sherlock Holmes later on. Palaki was one of these guys. He was a kind of refugee from the Habsburg Empire. He did know 7 languages. He was a bit of a police informer, did a bit of undercover work. One of those guys who hangs around on the sort of the outskirts of the secret world. Sort of the gray murk. He's an odd fellow. A lot of the time, his bread and butter is to, follow around adulterers for blackmail material for their soon-to-be ex-spouses. All this kind of stuff. Sanford hires him because they're kind of like 2 peas in the pod, and their job is to find Bullock to try and stop him. The problem with them is that they set off fire alarms wherever they go. Between Sanford saying things like, what we should do? When we find one of Bullock's ships carrying weapons or cotton, we should just blow it up in the Thames right outside Parliament and just pretend nothing to do with it. When Charles Francis Adams, the ambassador, finds out about this, he freaks because his job is to keep things on the level. His job is to make sure that the Brits don't get overexcited. Right? Their finger's already pulling the trigger for the South. If they hear word of Sanford's little escapades, it'll cause a colossal diplomatic ruckus. This comes to fruition during, where, as you mentioned, the Trent affair, where the 2 countries come sort of this close to going to war with each other. Sanford is the Captain Wilkes in Britain, of the sort of the land-based Captain Wilkes. He's a guy who acts by himself and doesn't ask permission. He doesn't even ask for forgiveness. He just does stuff. And so he has this crew of black operatives kind of thing. One too many operations go wrong, and Bullock escapes, and the British government notices what's going on. With a great deal of pleasure, Adams gets to fire Sanford and Palaki, for that matter, after one too many disasters. That leaves the role of Union intelligence open. Bullock is just running the table here. It's at that point that Dudley, just by happenstance, gets sent over as consul, which is a fairly low, embassy, diplomatic position, to Liverpool. And it falls upon him, because that is Bullock territory. It falls upon him to inherit, again, inadvertently, what has become the world's most critical intelligence posting. And that's how it all happens. So when Dudley inherits, he's instructed by Adams to, for God's sake, just no, covert operations. Don't blow it up. Stop getting into the newspapers. Whatever you do, just keep an eye on Bullock and send me, what Sanford had been supposed to do, which was called the blacklist. And that is simply a list of ships going in and out of Liverpool Harbor. That's it. That's all you need to do. And then we'll send it to the embassy. Embassy will send it to Washington. They'll transmit it to the U.S. Navy, and hopefully the U.S. Navy will then intercept those ships and, going by their descriptions. That's all you have to do. The problem then becomes much more complicated. And that's when it's at that point that Bullock starts moving on to phase 2, constructing the great commerce raiders, puts Dudley right in the eye of, in the heat of it. So that's when the game changes.
And the one thing too is right around then, for the most part, after the Trent Affair, England had kind of put the kibosh on sending weapons across. And when phase 2 started, when they're going to build those raiders, Bullock and company had to deal with something called the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819. And what that basically meant was, if you're going to build a merchant ship, and for the most part it says you can't, they wanted to maintain neutrality. You could not build warships that were going to be used against basically an ally. In this case, the United States. And so it was written in 1819. So it was it wasn't like they just put this on. But here's the challenge now. So for Bullock, he wants to build warships, but he knows he can't because of this. And they don't want to violate that. Some of the guys we'll talk about, Miller and Laird, some of the shipbuilders were very focused on this. So you had to build these ships that were basically merchant ships. And this is one of my favorite parts of this whole story is how they handled this loophole. So Section 7 specifically said no person in any part of the UK shall knowingly equip, furnish, fit out a vessel intended for attack on another foreign power friendly to Britain. But what Bullock did is he found a loophole. So what they would do is they would build these ships designed to be merchant ships. And how he handled this to get them weaponized is a fantastic stroke by Bullock.
Yeah, it was a brilliant move. The Foreign Enlistment Act of 1819 was originally passed in order to stop British mercenaries, just sort of adventurers signing up for little rebellions in South America. That was what it was for. It had never really been used. It had never come to court. It was this great 50-year-old bit of legislation that nobody really knew much about. But from Bullock's point of view, it is a huge obstacle because, as you read out, you cannot build, furnish, equip, knowingly a military ship in a British jurisdiction. And what's more, you cannot recruit British subjects to serve on those ships, at least knowingly. There's a lot of potential ifs and buts. You can sort of see how this is developing. Bullock reads the legislation over and over and over again, and he finds a loophole that you could literally almost literally sail a fleet through. And that is that so long as the ship is not knowingly built as a warship, but it's built as a civilian ship, and it's crewed by British sailors who are not knowingly serving on a potential warship, as long as that ship's built in Liverpool, but then it goes out to international waters, where the Queen's writ does not run. It can rendezvous with a tender, just an old freighter or something that's filled with munitions and guns and its armaments like cannons and so forth. You can rendezvous with that in international waters. You can then transfer over those armaments onto the so-called civilian ship. And at that point, a Confederate Navy set of officers can come over and commission the ship as a warship into the Confederate Navy. It's a brilliant plan. It all depends on the Liverpool shipbuilders, in the sense that they didn't ask any questions, and so Bullock could tell them no lies. And they're all in favor of Bullock. They all know who it's for. I mean, they're not fools.
Exactly.
But again, as long as they get covered, as long as they're not knowingly doing anything. As for the British crew, because there's a lot of sailors in Liverpool, it's easy to get a crew. As long as you don't tell them that this is going to be a Confederate ship, and you tell them it's a civilian ship and it's going to the Mediterranean or something, like to trade olives or olive oil or something, they will sign on. It's not a problem. And it just so happens that there's a change of plan as soon as you reach that territorial limit, and they're actually heading to the Azores or somewhere in the Atlantic. They'll meet up, a small tender, and then they'll be put to work. And then if they want to, Bullock was always very careful about this. He really insisted on it, that at the time when they're working in the middle of the ocean, crew has to be asked. They have to volunteer to sign up with the Confederate Navy, to be inducted into it. Anyone who doesn't want to has to go back on that tender. Because otherwise you get into problems with potential accusations of kidnapping and all this kind of stuff on the high seas. Just something you don't want to have. So this whole thing depends on lots and lots of funny cover stories that are being concocted by Bullock in Liverpool. He changes the names of ships. He creates front companies. He uses a bunch of sort of allies and friends, most of whom were in the blockade running trade as kind of cutouts and fake owners and all this kind of stuff in order to evade any kind of oversight by Dudley. So it takes Dudley a long time to kind of pierce this sort of carapace of lies that Bullock has managed to construct. So that's, again, part of the struggle. But then Dudley's problem is that he has no enforcement mechanism himself. He doesn't have any cops. He can't do anything. He has to then prove, and again, he's also underwater, for God's sake, don't blow anything up and Liverpool, no matter how deserved, don't start interfering in this stuff. Otherwise, we're the ones who are going to be in trouble. So he has to prove it legally, and he has to get sort of affidavits and testimonies and eyewitnesses and all this kind of stuff. And he has to bring it to Charles Francis Adams at the embassy. Adams has to then go to the Foreign Office. There's sort of processes you have to follow here, and persuade Lord Russell, who's the Foreign Secretary, that this is indeed a Confederate ship in all but name, and that this is a huge lie, and that they're trying to pull a fast one on you. So it takes Dudley a long time to get the British on side on this.
That enlistment act is kind of the hammer of Damocles over the whole thing. And it's Dudley trying to prove that it's military ships versus Bullock trying to find these different ways. The first ship he builds is to William C. Miller and Sons. It's going to be the ship, the Oretto, right? And this is going to be a 700-ton warship. They're building this ship, and everyone knows that it's going to be Confederate, but Dudley specifically, but he has no way to prove it. And it's interesting how, he gets little tips. Like you mentioned before, he's going to have people coming to him, and he's going to have spies and people ratting him out. He discovers that the engines are made by a company called Fawcett Preston. And he remembers that that's the same company that built the cannon that fired in Fort Sumter. A little bit of clues here and there that make him think that maybe this boat was not really built for Italy. The real owner is probably Charles Prelot. How these boats get built is fascinating. You mentioned how everything went on, so you have basically a fake crew of sailors who didn't know what they were in for, and a captain. So that the Oretto was a guy named James Dagwitt, and they'd sail out, and then they'd be basically, the tugboat would come with the guns, and then you'd have someone like a John Moffett come on, who was a Confederate naval officer, and they raised the Confederate flag, and they say, who wants to be involved? Dudley had one strike against him the whole time. He didn't realize that there was an agent working within the British government who was a spy, and they called him Agent X. And he's somebody, so whenever Dudley thought he had the upper hand, that he's going to go and raid this boat and prove that it's a gun runner, Bullock always seemed to know right before. And it happened with this boat, happened on the next boat, and it's because of Buckley, Victor Buckley, who was an Agent X working within the government, who has always seemed to undermine him. Be instrumental later in the whole thing coming undone, but there was so many people involved in this that Bullock had such a network set up that it's just fascinating to see how the cloak and dagger works with this.
It's a great story about the agent. When Dudley comes over, he can't work out what's going on. I mean, Bullock is, just runs everything. Liverpool is, 99% against the Union. Dudley has very, very few friends. The Union has very few friends in Liverpool. This is a Confederate town. When Bullock first showed up in Liverpool, he couldn't get over it. He was over the moon because he saw more Confederate bunting and flags in Liverpool than he'd seen in Richmond. I mean, it was incredibly pro. So Dudley's on very hostile ground here. Everyone seems to be conspiring against him. At one point, he compiles, and this is a bit in the book where he manages to compile, a sort of a secret list of the Confederate network within Liverpool. And there's hundreds of firms that Bullock could call on, hundreds of friends who could put up some money and all this kind of stuff and serve as cutouts and so on. But at the same time, Bullock just seems to be able to outplay him every single time. He always seems to be able to see around a corner before he can see him coming. I mean, he doesn't understand how this is happening. It takes him a long time to figure it out. One of the big sort of aces that Bullock had up his sleeve was this kind of a mole or an agent, an ally of the South called a young man called Victor Buckley, who worked on the American desk at the Foreign Office in London. And, an interesting character in his own right. And at key times, he would give the tip off to Bullock and say, because he would see all the correspondence coming between Adams and his superior, Lord Russell, on these matters. And he would say, look, Dudley's managed to get all these affidavits. British customs officials are going to be swooping probably in 2 days. So if you want to save everything, take action, kind of thing. Bullock would, get the ship out, just by a remarkable coincidence, mere hours before an inspection was about to happen. That would have uncovered the fact that this was actually a clandestine warship. A second thing is that, Bullock had his own methods. And one of those things was, I sort of found it in his papers. He had paid off Clark. Dudley had a solicitor called Mr. Squarey, was an excellent Victorian solicitor's kind of name, very, honest fellow called Squarey. He had a clerk, and he would be feeding him all of the information, all the stuff, that copies of the affidavits and all the information that Dudley had. So, so Bullock was fully aware of what was going on, and that was the key to his being able to pull off all these amazing magic tricks, these great works of psychic prediction of what was about to happen. But in fact, he wasn't. Dudley finds out once he begins cracking this case that he's not a great magician. He's a kind of a cheap conjurer. He has some tricks up his sleeve, but he's now being found out. And that's when the shoe moves to the other foot, and Dudley starts striking back. He's got his own friends now.
So the Oretto is going to turn into the CSS Florida. There'll be a second boat that was called the Enrica, which would be the same thing. And that's that second phase now. So now you've got these boats now that are going to attack these merchant ships. And you have some colorful characters. Raphael Semmes is a great villain if you study the Civil War.
His picture is just, I looked at his picture, I'm like, is this, like, again, it goes back, this needs to be a movie or a TV show, because he's just such a, like, he looks like a mean guy.
He does have an impressive mustache.
Yes.
Like, again,
wow.
He has as you say, a sort of a villain twirling kind of mustache. Yep. He was very proud of his mustache. Yeah, he was a very odd, intense, remote tyrant on board. A great character. One of these great Civil War characters that you don't find nowadays.
He was, Semmes was a hard dictator of a man. He hated everybody from New England, so he must have been a Steeler fan, probably. but that's how he was. He was just a guy, a real tough guy to deal with. But you know what, though? When he took his boat out with that second boat, out of the 90 original sailors who came, all but 10 offered to stay on. So as hard as he was, and this will become the CSS Alabama, that second runner now, this raider. So he certainly had a way with them. So as this is all going on now, you've got phase 1 done. Phase 2 is on its way. So the whole overall plan, if you're trying to break a blockade, one great way to do it is attack the merchants to force Lincoln to pull his boats off the line to start chasing these runners down. And that's going to create more gaps. It's also going to hurt morale, because don't forget, the South wasn't winning this war on might. They were going to win it on will. Mm-hmm. And they wanted people to lose that will. They were plundering. There's a story, I think it was Maffitt's boat, where he pulled basically $2 million worth of tea and gold off this, and off the Jacob Bell. And there's all kinds of stories about how this was. You're talking, this is Civil War, but we're talking pirates now and other things like this, piracy on the open seas. These are the things that it's just so intriguing to study. You mentioned Dudley was kind of getting wind of it finally. One of his spies, like a whistleblower, was a guy named Clarence Young, who was instrumental going forward this. And maybe what your thoughts about that was the letters he provided Dudley, specifically between Bullock and Stephen Mallory, to help kind of give a little bit more credence to the stuff that Dudley was accusing people like Preelo were doing.
Yeah, Clarence Young is, again, a kind of an awful man, but an interesting character, kind of a tragic figure in a way. I mean, he was very unpleasant. He had originally been one of Bullock's kind of private secretaries, in Liverpool. A young man. I think his family were from Georgia. They went back a few generations. The Youngs and the Bullocks had kind of known each other, or there's a couple of little kinship connections there, distant ones. Bullock thinks he's a nice fellow. He's quite efficient. He does his work, but he's also privy to a lot of very, very sensitive correspondence. When the Alabama goes out, Bullock arranges because Bullock needs someone he can trust on board. He sends Young out to be, I think, the purser. Young at that point begins to act up. He seems as not the kind of captain you act up with. So there were some accusations that Young had been a little light-fingered with the cash on board. The seaman's pay was kind of missing. And what's more, he used to get drunk a lot, not really be as shipshape as Seames demanded. Seames ran a very, very tight ship. So he gets dumped in, I think it's Jamaica. So Seames drums him off the ship in ignominy.
Like Jack Sparrow, right?
Yeah.
Dumped on the island.
I guess, yeah, exactly like that. And so Seames goes off, and then he does his own, well, he would say privateering. People say piracy. One man's pirate is another man's privateer, as they say. Young is obviously very angry, wants revenge. He manages through various means. He becomes a bigamist, marries a woman, basically takes her money, takes her back to Liverpool, then kind of leaves her in a hotel and does a runner, takes her money and does a runner, tries to do a runner back to the U.S. Yes, he's not one of the great, valiant men of our time, but he runs out of money just as he's about to get on a ship to the U.S. Well, he just says, okay, fine, I need some money. So he gets this package of paper. He actually is a walk-in. he goes to the American embassy in London, demands to see Charles Francis Adams, and says, I've got the mother of all secrets, and I know how Bullock does it. And Adams is quite interested, and it's one of these weird historical coincidences. It's just at that moment that Dudley walks in to the embassy from Liverpool. He'd been on a train with a package of letters backing up everything that Clarence Young has been saying, because he had bought those letters from Clarence Young's, second wife in Liverpool, who was understandably quite aggrieved at young Clarence, being dumped in the middle of nowhere. With the young walk-in plus these documents, I mean, they had everything. Because remember, Bullock had always kept hands off. His name hadn't been in any contracts. Suddenly he's got all of this hard copy with Bullock's signature on everything, going back and forth with the Confederates. I mean, just blowing this whole charade of, I'm just an innocent businessman over here building civilian shit, out of the water. And that's when Dudley knows that he has Bullock. He's finally got the goods on him. But it's not quite as simple a story as that that's the end of the story. I mean, it actually,
right,
the whole thing blows up in his face later on.
Yeah, like in any mafia movie, you get the bookkeeper. That's the guy you want, especially a disgruntled bookkeeper, and that's what Clarence Young was.
Like Charles Grodin is the accountant kind of thing.
Yeah. Exactly. So now Dudley and this is right around the same time where that third phase is beginning. This is when the Laird rams come into the story. There are two ironclad boats. These are 225 feet long with a metal ram, rotating gun turrets. These are state-of-the-art steam engines. These are the boats that can help you have the best army in the world, best navy in the world. For the Lairds, they build kind of the specifically iron boats. Well, they did some wooden ones too, but mostly iron boats. But these are the state-of-the-art. These are big projects. And they're going to build two boats. And these are going to be the boats that are going to be used to punch Lincoln's Navy in the mouth. These aren't blockade runners. These aren't raiders. These are going to be the warships. So obviously right off the bat, there's no way in the world you're going to get around the Enlistment Act with this one. So they're going to be military boats. So they're going to be issues right off the bat. And so Bullock, it's going to be a challenge for him to figure this thing out. And this is when you're going to basically introduce two more characters into the story, Adrian and Francois Brevet. This is kind of one of those, if you're going to have a spy type story, you need people like this. It's kind of the yin and the yang of brothers of how they ultimately play itself out. Their story of how they end up pulling Egypt into this and trying to find a scapegoat to build these boats, to get these boats back, is probably my favorite part of how this whole thing went down. And I'm sure you enjoyed looking at that yourself.
It was a complicated, very murky case to unpick and unpack. Exactly what happened during the Laird Rams affair. You're right. These are two ironclad warships you cannot pass off as civilian ships. And so Bullock has to come up with some kind of great cover story. The fact is that at the time, there were many countries in the world where the governments wanted to build navies. I mean, the Chinese emperor, for instance, was in the market for building a navy. They were shopping for ships. I mean, why not? Bullock comes up with this idea that uses as an intermediary this very dubious pair of French financiers called the Brevets, who were, again, a bit of an odd couple, but they had a lot of connections in Egypt, which was then very, very close to France. And they had made a fortune. And it's kind of a long story, a very complicated story short. One of the Brevets kind of pretends or comes up with a story that the ruler of Egypt, sort of the Grand Pasha of Egypt, had ordered these two warships for his navy. And that Brevet was the arms dealer, and he was going to deal with the Laird shipyards, and it was all going to be in his name and all this kind of stuff. It was a great cover story. The point is that what was going to happen was that the two ships would be in Brevet's name by the Lairds for an official government commission. Nothing wrong with that. And they would go out to sea, and then ownership would be transferred back to Bullock, and then the Confederate crew would come aboard, and then these things would go out and sink the Navy. They were more powerful than anything the U.S. Navy had at the time. Indeed, most navies had. It all goes to pieces through various means, because as Dudley starts investigating this cover story, and it gets more and more murky about which Egyptian ruler actually gave this permission. Do you have anything on paper? And all those sort of. It's obviously a shady story once you start looking into it. And Dudley then finally manages to persuade Lord Russell, the Foreign Secretary, that this is garbage. Ridiculous.
It's a great story because, Francois Brevet, he meets Saeed Pasha. He's at a shoe store, and he ends up having this friendship with them, making all this money. And he makes the deal with Saeed. But before he can get the contract done, Saeed dies. He's 40 years old. He's a big party guy. If I remember correctly, didn't he die after like drinking like a bunch of champagne all at once and just died? There was some sort of random death to him. But he was a party guy. He only had a verbal agreement to build these ships. The guy who took over for Saeed is a guy named Ismail Pasha. And they didn't get along. And so when Brevet goes and he's questioned about this, and he has these boats, he says, I've got a verbal contract. And that's really where they kind of hang their hat on, is we don't have anything specific. Brevet is going to name these boats the El Tasson and the El Monacer. And he tries to play it out a certain way. Once these ships are ready to go, and we're talking like October, November 1863 right about now, it's all kind of falling apart. And it's a great way how it all finds out, because they find out in a way by going at the other brother. And that's a great story, is when the French go to question Adrian about this arrangement. And this is kind of where the unraveling really begins.
Adrian was the brother who used to stay at the office back in Paris. Mm-hmm. It was his brother Francois who was the real wheeler dealer kind of guy. Adrian was the weak link, and the British start investigating. Lord Russell, he's heard about it from Dudley, doesn't quite believe him. Maybe it's true, but this is a bit far-fetched. I mean, not even Bullock would try something so audacious. Russell had also checked with the laird, the great ship owners, the great shipyard guys, and they had told him, no, we don't know anything about this. No, these are for the Egyptian Navy. So they would have had to have lied directly to his face, which is inconceivable. This could not be happening. But anyway, he checks out. So Adrian gets squeezed in Paris along the lines of, we're beginning to think that this is rubbish. We're going to crush you. And we're going to get the French government to crush you. Essentially, you could be spending the next 50 years in prison, or you could start talking. And by doing that, you could save not only yourself, but your brother. And maybe you'll come out of this with a small profit if we buy the ships from you, just to clear them off the board. So that's when Adrian cracks, and then he shows them what's in the safe, and there's sort of the smoking gun that links Brevet to Bullock to the lairds, all essentially conspiring to break the Foreign Enlistment Act. And that's sort of the final piece of the puzzle. At that point, it doesn't matter if you have a mole in the Foreign Office. At that point, you have Royal Marines being sent in to occupy the laird's shipyard and to take over and to put a huge gun warship right in front of the laird's building works to make sure that no ships are leaving that yard to go out to sea. But so that's essentially how that brings Bullock to heel. I mean, he'll try. He has a few other small successes, but essentially is the back is broken on this thing directly because of Dudley.
He sends Russell's man. His name was Captain Hoare, a very unfortunate name, not for nothing, but that's what it was. He goes to go meet with him. They threaten him, and he goes, well, let me go to my safe. Let me show you these notarized contracts between James Bullock and the lairds. A notarized agreement between the two. It was that ironclad, see what I did there? Piece of evidence that they needed. And so for Dudley, it seems that it's case closed. And to your point, there are some things that go on a little bit later. It's not as cut and dry. But this is finally what it was. Bullock was busted. He's going to tell Stephen Mallory, that the Secretary of the Navy of the Confederacy, it was an act which caused me greater pain, and I regret that I ever conceived it possible to feel. Because now he's going to sell these boats to the British. That's what he's going to have to do. Plan of this third phase of attack with these boats, it just isn't going to happen. Dudley finally won this battle over the Rams, and Bullock finally lost. And that must have felt so good for Dudley. It must have, when Adrian pulled out those papers. Because Bullock had always, like you said, kept his name out of it. He never used his real name except in a real small number of cases. And now he's got the goods that ties them together completely.
That's essentially it's not the end of the story by any means. Right. There's still, Bullock is not the kind of guy who just goes, oh, okay, well, that's it. I'm going to walk away now. He's still another year and a half of the war to go. But it's, Bullock is from that moment, he's on his back foot. He's not the one playing offense. He's on the defense. And Dudley has the upper hand here. And then one of the reasons is that British public opinion had shifted since the Emancipation Proclamation. Mm-hmm. This wasn't the same atmosphere of Confederate flags everywhere in 1861, 1862. By 1863, as even Dudley notices, in Liverpool, this is the heartland of Dixieism in the UK, there are huge halls that are being packed out with thousands of people coming to abolitionist speeches intended to become pro-union. So there's this shift in Liverpool and within the country at large. But essentially, he's got some disadvantages, but Dudley has the wind at his back. Bullock knows this. A, trying to wind down operations, and B, get out of this with Charles Prelow, the dark financier of the whole thing, save their skins, just to try and destroy any evidence of what had happened. They have a couple of more successes, small successes. This is just, this game is winding down. And then we move into the final part of the book.
Yeah, and then certainly, the money taps out. November 1864, Lincoln's going to be reelected. They had those Erlanger bonds, which are basically bonds that you could buy to get caught later on. And if the Union Army had won, those bonds were completely worthless. It was a high risk, high reward, and it was like the stock market. As the Union did well, it dropped. As the southern states did well, it rose. But they'd be worthless at the end, and so the money starts to run out. And then so when you get to that point, the final stage of kind of tying the whole thing together. To me, the writing was on the wall for all of this, but they didn't go down easy. They really didn't. And it took a while for Dudley to finally be able to get what he felt was his just cause and finally put Bullock away, although it never really happened that way. But it certainly, to get to that point, Charles Prelow at that point was running out. He was running out of money as well. He'll end up dying after the war, basically humiliated. But there's a lot that goes into this beyond that. But you can clearly see with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was a huge deal, with Lincoln re-election, and then the blockade starting to show a little more teeth. There was less cotton getting back and forth. And then when the bonds started falling, you could see the cash running out. That's really the beginning of the end in most cases like this.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, also the U.S. Navy is just getting better at catching blockade runners. The early years of the war, hundreds of these things were getting through. If you were someone who wanted to fancy a little bit of a bet, if you lived in Liverpool, you would invest in a blockade runner. Like 1861, 1862. Yeah. And you could be almost guaranteed that you would triple your money. I mean, if you look at the money, it was a good investment, and it was fun. You got that kind of thrill of breaking the law, doing the right thing for the South kind of thing. But essentially, it was a money proposition. The problem is that as the U.S. Navy gets better and better intercepting these blockade runners, they change their own tactics to catch more of them in the net, so to speak, as they're going in and out of the ports, is that this becomes a very expensive bit of speculation. At one point, if 50% of these runners are being caught at a time, as opposed to 90% of them getting through beforehand, then what happens is that once the Union captures a ship, the whole thing is taken off the board. The captain, the crew, they're all taken prisoner. The ship and everything on it, your entire investment just went like that. Yeah, you're not going to be so keen on investing anymore, especially since the South doesn't have the kind of money to pay for this stuff anymore. I mean, it's nowhere near as profitable. So you've got that problem, and then which is squeezing Prelow very, very hard. You've got the breakdown of the embargo. You've got, the great shift in public opinion towards the North, and you've got all these mounting potential legal problems. And also, as you said, the Erlanger loan, the bonds problem, that Prelow had huge amounts invested in this. He was one of the great organizers of this thing, which was some of the funds of it were being diverted into Bullock's shipbuilding. Again, as soon as the South starts really losing battles and the speculators can see that the South is on the losing, the price of the bonds is going, your worldly wealth is caught up in these things. I mean, you're done. That's it. Now, Prelow and Bullock still have a couple of little surprises, before they try and agitate a little bit to prevent Lincoln becoming president by pushing, what's his name? The general.
McClellan.
By pushing his suit because they think that he'll arrange an armistice with the South, and they can totally drag out a kind of a vague peace out of this whole thing. But of course, it failed, and Lincoln gets reelected. And after that, this is just really a matter of basically getting rid of evidence, and trying to make sure that you don't get dragged back to the United States for a trial of some kind. But again, you're right in that Dudley believes at the end of the war that Bullock escaped justice, because Bullock's clever enough not to be incriminated, to be caught out. Mm-hmm. And he cuts into new Union authorities, with the United States authorities, to sort of let him off the hook. But that, for Dudley, this guy had created so many problems. He wasn't funny. This wasn't a game. He wants to really bring him to justice. And so he doesn't drop. He doesn't simply forgive and forget. Yeah. He does neither. essentially.
Must have been so frustrating for Dudley because, Bullock, and even after this was all over with, he had a boat that was basically commandeered by the federal government. And so after the war, the government paid him, was like $8,000. They gave him $8,000 for the loss of his boat. So even after this whole thing of, to trying to destroy the Union Navy, he ended up receiving money from the Union Navy for taking one of his boats at the end of the war. Yeah. So he just seemed to fall back into it all the time. And, after the war, he's going to try to write his story. He's going to try to tell his story. If I remember correctly, he became a British citizen somewhere along the way to stay out there. But he tries to get that book published. He tries to do it, and he has no luck until his nephew, which you mentioned before, is Teddy Roosevelt, is going to hook him up with G.P. Putnam to help him publish his book. And it was great because there are these stories of Bullock going to Long Island and sitting with Teddy and talking Navy in 1877. Bullock is a guy, when he will die, he's going to be buried in England. His stone says American by birth, British by choice, right in his gravestone. He's just a fascinating guy. When Teddy Roosevelt's going to write his book himself, he's going to write a book called The Naval War of 1812. He's going to credit Captain James Bullock, formerly of the U.S. Navy, as one of his references. It doesn't mention a word about the Confederates. So he seems to always land on his feet historically, or however you want to play it, versus Dudley seems to be the guy who just keeps falling on himself. He gets there at the end, but he doesn't get that resolution, that satisfaction that he thinks he's going to get. Like you said, he felt Bullock got off very, very easy for what he did.
Bullock was clever enough to have been able to cut a deal at the end of the war with the U.S. authorities. He would cooperate, to a limited extent, and again, covering up a lot more than he gave away. And in return, the U.S., the United States after the war, was not that interested in chasing up old Confederates. They had, there was Reconstruction. There was a lot of other problems going on that they had to deal with, rather than dealing with some guys like Bullock who had been foreign agents in a foreign country, and getting them back to the U.S. was going to be a real trouble anyway. Was there any political will to prosecute them? And, from Bullock's point of view, too, he could say, well, one of the reasons he took out becoming a British subject was precisely to stop any kind of potential problem, start taking British subjects back to America for a trial. But it was never going to really happen anyway. They got other things to do. Dudley, that's just not enough. Because Bullock just gets away clean. He becomes a respectable cotton businessman after the war. So Dudley continues to crusade, and he says, look, someone has to pay for this. Something has to be exposed. And so he agitates and persuades Adams, this is a great idea, that to basically sue, just very put simply, sue the British government after the war in Geneva for the damages caused by the Florida and the Alabama on American shipping that he said the British had kind of turned a blind eye to. It's a colossal case, very, very interesting case. And at the end of it, the British kind of, I think it's, it
was 15 million, wasn't it?
Yeah, to make the problem go away. Yeah. They kind of don't admit guilt kind of thing. But they pay off about $15 million in gold to the U.S. for these damages caused by, carelessness. $50 million in 1872, when the Alabama claims arbitration happened, was, a lot of money. So the U.S. did very well out of this. But what it does is that Bullock's name is mentioned repeatedly over and over and over and over again in the testimony that put together, and the affidavits put together by Dudley and uttered by Adams, who was the U.S. representative in Geneva on this. So so Bullock is exposed as the sort of the centerpiece of this whole of the Confederate clandestine navy, and it was as the proximate cause of all of these losses. Dudley does get a measure of revenge and justice on this. So it's a bit of a happy ending.
The U.S. was shooting for the moon with England. You look at that court case. One of the things they said, give us Canada, we'll call it even. Mary, you wouldn't like that.
Yeah, I know. It's like, give us Canada.
It's done, yeah.
Like, put us on the chopping block.
But there's a lot of deals. But the British were in 1872. The British were more concerned with creating Anglo-American amity for the great the world to come. There were challenges from a resurrected Germany and all this kind of stuff. So they just wanted to be friends after the little embarrassment of the Civil War. So they paid out, and then everybody's buddies. That was essentially how this deal worked. A happy development was that Bullock got nailed to the wall on it as well.
Yeah. His perception-wise, Dudley will get his just suppose a little bit with that, but I think it's such a fascinating study to talk about it. Dudley himself will die. He'll have a heart attack leaving a Philadelphia train station right down on Broad Street, actually, and so his story is going to end. But really, all these people are just people who I don't want to say have been lost to history, but are not A-listers. And what's great about your book, Alex, is you're bringing them alive again. Is now people who read your book are going to sit there and say, I'm going to study this more. I want to find there's so much intrigue. There's so many cool people involved in this I never would have heard about. And that's what history is all about. It's bringing people back to life again who don't have a voice anymore.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, you're dealing with very, very, distinct, idiosyncratic characters, and they're very typical of the Victorian era. These kind of these. I think I said it about Sanford somewhere, that he's one of these sort of types of Victorians that you don't really see anymore. Like if you told them some venture was perilous, they would say, "Excellent, sign me up."
Yeah.
Let's go. These great world builders and conquerors and that kind of thing. So you see a lot of that with the war, especially when they're pushed to the forefront in these grand sort of titanic clashes of ideologies.
And I think too, like the Confederate Navy and the Union Navy, the Navy overall in the Civil War is not something that it doesn't get studied a lot by people. And that's another thing your book does, is I think it would pique the interest of somebody to look further into it. It's a great jumping off point to get more into it.
When I was coming up with the idea, a long time ago, but it took me a while to figure out how to do it, how to break the story. I didn't want to do, another Blue and the Gray. I've written about Gettysburg before in Men of War, great stuff. It's just, I didn't want to do spying during the land war. I mean, there's been books before about people like Belle Boyd and Rose Greenhow and all this. But what I really liked was that was the Navy, which again is an understudied, unappreciated aspect of not just the Civil War, but many wars, the maritime theater. The second is that it took place not even in America; it took place in Britain. Third, there's no uniforms in it. There's no Gettysburg in it. It's just two very different men basically fighting each other. Sort of, two men enter, one man leaves, kind of sort of a Liverpudlian Thunderdome of sorts.
It's a great story. And I learned so much reading your book, and it's a great story to tell.
What's next for you, Alex? What's next on the plate for you?
Just signed a contract to write a similar kind of book, short, fast, about intelligence, about a subject I thought I always swore I'd never do, and that was, but of course I ended up doing it, is World War II. So I was thought, I think there's enough books about World War II. So, is there anything new to say about World War II? And it turns out there actually is. There's a very interesting intelligence war that went on vis-a-vis the sort of the search to capture a German U-boat and take it alive. And it's a great, fantastic story about these again, two men, but this time they're allies, not enemies. One of them handles the intelligence aspects of tracking and finding this submarine, in the middle of the Atlantic, and the other guy is this kind of rogue captain who is determined, like Ahab. It's his big dream that he just wants to bring in a U-boat and sail this thing through New York Harbor with an American.
Yeah.
As a kind of as one of those, as the Romans used to do, they used to bring back the trophies and during their triumphs. That's what he wanted to do. So it's this fantastic story. So I'm sort of writing it now. I'm sort of talking about a naval story for some reason. I don't know why. That's just a coincidence, I think.
Yeah. And Mary, what's next for us?
Next, we have to come up with some more podcasts to do past episode 100, which obviously we will be. We are going to be having a hangout in Gettysburg on February the 18th at 1:00 at Foursquare Brewing. So that's in celebration of our 100th episode. We will be doing that. Huge thank you to all our listeners for these past 100 episodes. Couldn't be here without you. And huge thank you to Alex Rose for joining us to talk about his book, The Lion and the Fox.
Thank you so much for joining us with this. I think this is a great story, and it's you tell the story so well. You'll be joining us on our book club here pretty soon.
Yes, that's the other thing to let our listeners know before we end this episode is the book club. We'll be joined by Alex to talk about the book club, about his book. So join us for that. Come on, ask questions and all that. We will be able to talk more about The Lion and Fox at that time. So Darren, any parting words?
No, I think it's great, Alex. It's an honor to have you on here. We love your past work. Some of the stuff you've written, the stuff that's been on television. It's just fantastic to have you on here. And it's a great story to tell. You're a great storyteller, and you the ultimate compliment I can give anybody is you bring these people back to life again. You did an absolutely fantastic job at this. You did these people a great service by doing this book.
No, thanks for saying that. I'm glad you found it interesting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a wrap for episode 100. So we will be back with our listeners when this episode drops. We're on to episode 101. So thank you, Darren, for being an awesome co-host. And thank you, Alex, for joining us for this episode. And we will see everybody else on the other side.